there's about half as much ice, summer sea ice in the Arctic as there was 30 years ago. That is to say, one of the 3 or 4 biggest physical features on Earth we've managed to change in the most dramatic way in the course of a single generation. And of course, when you make changes like that, the things that happen as a kind of follow-on are enormous. We no longer have, for much of the year, that big white reflective shield up at the top of the Earth that bounces back out to space about 80% of the sun's rays. Instead, increasingly, it's blue water that absorbs all that incoming energy and just amps up this whole reaction. Last week, we had simultaneously in the mountains above Los Angeles, 80,000 people evacuated from their homes in the course of an afternoon because of a wildfire that raging as now they're raging across the American West after 5 years of drought. Meanwhile, the same day, there were 80,000 people or so out of their homes in Louisiana because we were having the absolute record rainfall ever measured there. Even more rain. I mean, it was a kind of rainstorm that used to come with a hurricane, but there was no hurricane. There was just 2.5 feet of water falling in the course of a day or two, and overwhelming. So all the people who survived Hurricane Katrina are now going through and doing the same thing they did then, ripping out the walls and floors of their house, trying to keep it from going to mold. We learned about 11 months ago, beginning about 11 months ago, with a series of remarkable investigative journalism reports in the United States, from the Los Angeles Times, the Columbia Journalism School, and others, who did remarkable job of finding whistleblowers and doing old archival research about the biggest fossil fuel company on Earth, Exxon. And it turns out that Exxon knew everything there was to know about climate change by the early 1980s. They had the best scientists in the world, not surprisingly. Carbon was their business. They were finding out all they could about it. They knew what was going to happen. They knew how much the temperature was going to go up, and they knew what it would mean. And they took that information and used it internally to figure out things like their bidding strategy for the Arctic ice that they knew was going to melt, or to make sure that they built their own drilling platforms to account for the rise in sea level that they knew was coming. Okay? What they didn't do was tell any of the rest of us just the opposite. They spent tens, hundreds of millions of dollars building the architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation, all the kind of phony front groups and pretend think tanks and things that kept us locked for 25 years in a completely sterile and pointless battle about the reality of climate change, instead of what they, and all the other fossil fuel companies doubtless too, knew was the reality. If one thinks about that for very long, one can get angry. It's, without any question, the greatest corporate scandal of all time. They wasted what may turn out to be the most important quarter century in recent geological history. They may turn out to have wasted the last quarter century we had to really get a hold of things. If, when, say, my great hero Jim Hansen, the NASA scientist, had testified before Congress in 1988 that climate change was underway, if the Exxon scientists had merely stood up and said, you know what, that's what our data shows too, no one would have accused Exxon of being climate alarmists, you know. Everyone would have said, okay, we've got a problem, we need to go to work. We wouldn't have solved climate change by this point, but we'd be well on the way to solving it. The trajectory would be going in the right direction. So, once I, much too slowly, figured out that we were engaged in a fight, the question becomes how to fight. We weren't going to match the money of the fossil fuel industry. We were going to have to find another currency to work in, and the only available one is the currency of movements, you know, passion, spirit, creativity, the willingness sometimes to put your body on the line, go to jail. Those over long, history of the last 100 years have been the way that we actually changed big things when they had to change. And so we set to work trying to make that movement happen. Sometimes you hear people say we need a World War II kind of mobilization to deal with climate change. And I kind of wondered what that meant and went and did my best to kind of track down all the numbers. We would need an industrial effort at that kind of scale to produce enough solar panels and enough windmills and things in the requisite time. But it is doable. It's on the outer edge of doable. It would take real leadership to make it happen. But that's what one does when one is in a crisis of this size, if one is smart. And you can sense the world's leaders beginning to figure this out, or at least beginning to figure out that they have to do something in some way to at least appear to be responding. We started really with what turned into the kind of totemic, iconic environmental fight in North America in the last 20 or 30 years, this fight against the Keystone Pipeline in 2011. No one had heard of this thing, but Jim Hansen from NASA said, you know what, there's so much carbon up there in the tar sands in Alberta where this pipeline was originating, that if you manage to get all of it out of the ground, all the economically recoverable tar sands oil just from Alberta in Canada, and you burned it, then the atmospheric concentration of CO2 would go to 550 parts per million just from that, okay? So we didn't think we were going to win, but we decided we had to fight, and we asked people to come to Washington and get arrested, and it turned into the largest civil disobedience action about anything in my country in 30 years. And then that sort of energized people, and for 4 years, people wrote more emails to the Senate than about any issue in history and filed more public comments and marched, and we had 400,000 people in the street in New York City almost 2 years ago now, and things like that. And what do you know, last fall, finally, President Obama said, okay, we won't build this thing, which was good because it keeps a lot of oil in the ground every day. But it was better because it was really the first time the big oil had ever lost something that they really wanted. And it helped people all over the place, at least all over North America, but I think in much of the rest of the world too, understand that it was actually possible to beat these guys. One of the things that we did and tried to get going around the world with some success was instead of just always playing defense against new pipeline projects and things, was also to try and play offense, to put the fossil fuel industry on the back foot for a while. And the best tool that we figured out yet to do that is this divestment campaign that's been going on now for about 4 years. It started when a small group of financial analysts here in the UK put out a really important report that showed how much carbon the fossil fuel industry had in its reserves, the stuff they'd told their shareholders and their banks that they were going to dig up and burn, okay? And the amount was about 3,000 gigatons worth of carbon in all the coal and gas and oil that they have mapped out and ready to go. The problem with that number is the scientists say that if we're going to stay below, never mind 1.5 degrees, if we're going to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, we can only burn about 500 gigatons. So we've got 6 times as much. I mean, these guys are literally on their books. Their plan is to wreck the planet, okay? And so we were trying to figure out kind of ways to stop that. We're at the point where we need to go outside our comfort zones, all of us, okay? We're no longer at a point with climate change where individual action is of the most important thing to be doing. I mean, look, I've changed all my light bulbs now 2 or 3 times as we've come out with different things. And I've got solar panels all over my roof, and I drove the first electric Ford in Vermont, and that's all good, but I try not to fool myself in any way that that's how we're going to solve climate change. This is a structural and systemic problem rooted in the balance of economic and political power, and it will be solved if we solve it at all, if we stand up to those structures and systems. That means organizing. And if we do it smartly, if we do it through things like divestment or through stopping huge infrastructure projects, those have big ripple effects. Our job is to hold down the fossil fuel industry for a few more years so that that surging tide of renewable energy can cut out the legs from underneath the entire industry. It's possible to imagine it, but we're in the critical couple of years, just as we're seeing the kind of effects of climate change now come crashing down on us. It's the moment when we have to make a stand, and that stand will necessarily be, if it's prophetic, it'll necessarily be uncomfortable to one degree or another. I didn't think that young people should have to be the cannon fodder in that particular battle. They lead most of the fight around climate change. Almost everybody I work with is young, around the world. But to go get arrested, I mean, if you're 22 in our economy, there's at least an argument to be made that the best item on your resume might not be your arrest record, okay? One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, And so it was with great pleasure that we watched. I mean, there were lots of people with hairlines like mine arriving in Washington to get arrested. We didn't ask people, how old are you? Because that would be rude. But we did, quite cleverly, I think, say, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administration. On the last day of these protests, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He was so old that he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which was so long ago, I have my degree in American history. I'd forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration, okay? So what was good about that was, for the young people who were there, they got to see their elders acting the way that elders are supposed to act in a working civilization, okay? Which was really good. There is nothing in the least radical about what we're talking about. Just the opposite, All we're asking for is a world that works a little bit like the world worked in the Holocene, which is the only world that we know even comes close to working for human beings. All the human beings that we have records of lived in that period. And so to say we'd like a little of that, we'd like a world that still had some ice left at the North and the South Poles, we'd like a world where there was still some coral, that's not radical. That's, if you think about it, fairly deeply conservative. Radicals work at oil companies, okay? If you're willing to make your fortune, and they made big fortunes, by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, and they were willing to do it once scientists had told you what was going to happen, and then once you could see that the scientists were right. If you looked, like most of the oil companies of the world, at the Arctic that you had melted, and instead of saying, maybe that's a sign we should slow down, if you looked at that and instead said, now it'll be easier to drill for more oil, okay, then you are a radical on a scale we have not encountered on this planet before, and our job is to figure out how to check that radicalism in some way. Our political system, rich, powerful companies have way more sway than they should in the way that decisions get made, okay? That's why our Congress has done nothing for 25 years. And so, yes, people should behave responsibly, and that's very good. But people, often people on TV station or something will ask me, what are the 3 most important things that people should do? And I know that they want me to list, change your light bulbs, take the bus. I always say the first thing you should do is organize. The second thing you should do is get together with your neighbors and organize. The third thing you should do is organize all your neighbors together to do something. And if you have some energy left over after that, then by all means make sure that you change your light bulbs and whatever too. Because that's, given the hole that we're in now, given this time in which we have to make change on the scale which we have to make it, I don't see any other path out rather than fighting. What's the most strategic use of people's energy, time, whatever? So you can make the argument that what we should do is concentrate on changing our lifestyles and get other people to follow along. I'm willing to bet that most of the people in this room have changed their lifestyles to one degree or another in fairly important ways, that they're eating lower on the food chain or whatever. But I don't think that the strategic path lies forward in having people perfect their lives. And as I said, if we had 50 years, that's a good model. But we don't have 50 years. So if we can get, in the States at the moment, for instance, 0.5% of people are totally vegan, all right, in their diets. So if we ran a big campaign for the next 5 years with maybe we could take that to 3 or 4% of people, okay, which would have essentially no impact on the atmospheric concentration of CO2. But 3 or 4% of people, if we can get them mobilized in a political fight, are enough to win all the battles that we need. 3 or 4% of people exert enormous leverage if they're on the march, if they're moving. In my country, it couldn't have been more than 1% of Americans who ever took part in the civil rights movement, went to a sit-in or got arrested or whatever, but they changed the flavor of the entire political landscape, and with that came real change. If we get that real change, if, for instance, we got a serious price on carbon that reflected the damage it did in the atmosphere, then that would quickly filter back down to all the kinds of decisions that everybody makes every day. The only question is whether we can make it happen fast enough to catch up with physics, and that depends entirely on our actions. If we go outside our comfort zones and push our institutions outside their comfort zones, then we have a chance. If we go along at the loping pace that we're currently going, then physics wins. That's just as bottom line as it could be. Thank you all very much for bearing with this depressing and